Hello.
Hi.
Nice to see you. It's been a delight to get to know you and your now fiancé, Mick, over the last little while. But there's a number of people here because they go to different services. They may not know you particularly well or have met you before. So if, hypothetically, you were on a dating app, how would you describe yourself in the little bio?
I'm Grace, so she and they pronouns. I'm 24. I'm a Scorpio. Yeah, I think in my kind of day-to-day job, like paid job, I work as the Climate and Racial Justice Director at the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. But more broadly around that, I think just I'm really passionate about building like generation-wide consciousness and ability for young people to take action on the things that they care about in their lives and, yeah, create the changes that they need to see that in the world that they inherit for themselves.
I love that, yeah. Outside of work stuff, how would like your friends describe you?
Oh, I think there's a real mixed bag. It depends on who you ask.
Yeah. If you slip them some money, how would they describe you?
I think they would probably say that I'm someone who's like always been someone that's like kind of tried to advocate for the things that I believe in my life. I'm one of those like friends that will like call you out if something isn't right, which is both like a warning and a welcome. Yeah, I think love a laugh, love a dance floor. The one thing in the world I have stamina for is a dance floor.
Okay.
But yeah, I think that's like a broad summary of me.
Love that.
Yeah.
Okay. So the AYCC, you work in the AYCC. Before we talk about your role, tell us a bit about that particular organisation.
Yeah, so the AYCC stands for Australian Youth Climate Coalition, which in some ways is like pretty self-explanatory. It's about Australian youth climate. The coalition is a strange part of it. Originally started as an organisation where there was a whole bunch of different youth groups that came together to form and address the need of young people in climate change back in 2007. And yeah, like we're coming out onto our 18th birthday this year, which is quite the milestone in a young person's life, let alone a young organisation, which would actually make us the longest running youth-run organisation on climate change in this country. Yeah, but I think serves many purposes, whether that's huge levels of like capacity building and training of young people to be able to advocate, to lobby, to like organise, to meet their communities where they're at on climate change and other intersecting issues with that, whether that's disability justice, First Nations justice, racial justice, like the whole range of looking at climate change is not just an issue about the environment, but also a social and economic one that intersects with all of these huge problems that we're seeing in our lives, whether that's cost of living or natural disasters and who's left behind in natural disasters. So yeah, it's very much about that sort of work. But yeah, the campaigns that we kind of work on have been historically like helping to stop Adani's coal mine up in Queensland, which we worked on for like 10 years. We currently kind of focus on stopping large-scale fracking, which is like the most dangerous form of gas extraction in the Northern Territory and WA, which is kind of like has been resisted by traditional owners for many decades now. And so backing in their fights as young people across the country to, yeah, kind of keep fossil fuels in the ground so that we can actually see the solutions and invest in the solutions that we need for our communities.
So it sounds like part of the work of AYCC is going to schools and other organisations to educate, and part of the role is to kind of rally them to advocate themselves, you know, for climate justice or for...
Yeah, often it's literally just unlocking, giving them the skills for the passion that they already have. Where, I think every year our base gets younger and younger. I think now there's like primary school children who are like, I want to meet with the Prime Minister, and we're like, okay, cool, here's how you do that. And so I think
that's great.
So I think it's actually just like this building consciousness of young people in our society who can see these problems but don't know how to articulate and act on that, and instead feel quite anxious and quite like isolated in the world, and actually providing them with like the friends and the outlet and the skills to be able to engage and be a part of a solution.
I imagine then there's kind of a pastoral element to the work of AYCC, right? Is to enable kids and youth to feel like A, they're not alone, and B, they do actually have a voice if we can harness that.
Yeah, definitely. I think this hidden part of the job is the youth work part of the job.
Sure.
And yeah, just like the high levels of like climate anxiety that young people feel.
100%.
And yeah, I think like sitting down with them and understanding them as full human beings is not just like a volunteer on like their weekends, but actually as holistic, complicated people who
Already,
care
when they
deeply
grow
about this.
up, like now.
Yeah. So I think there's definitely that aspect of pastoral care.
Yeah. So your role, climate and racial justice
Director.
Okay.
Yeah.
How would you describe that role to someone who hasn't engaged with you in that world before?
Yeah, it's a weird title, isn't it? Because it doesn't actually describe anything that I do. Classic
That's often the
jobs.
case, right?
Classic jobs.
Yeah.
I think what that looks like is partially like the climate justice side of it is looking at huge campaigns and capacity building on the ground with communities, particularly communities who have been impacted by climate disasters, whether that's Far North Queensland right now with multiple cyclones, or if it's with like the huge levels of drought and flooding each season in like the top end in the Northern Territory. But then there's also the racial justice side of my work. So I get to work with young people of colour, like young multicultural people, to engage their communities on climate change. So looking at the real gaps in both the climate movement, but in what our broader society is actually able to do and address with climate change, and then who are the people falling through those gaps. And that's almost always going to be First Nations and multicultural communities who like face huge levels of cultural and language barriers, institutional distrust of the government, and like historical harm. And so trying to like think about what are the ways that young people in those communities who are already part of those communities and are trusted messengers can start to bridge those gaps and actually bring those communities into the solutions that they often need first. And so that's kind of like part of my job, but there's also lots and lots of other pieces around like, I feel like I constantly am meeting people here that are like, are you a regular? And I'm like, yeah, I've been here for years, but I'm just all over the place all the time.
Because you travel a lot, right?
Yeah, so I think there's a large aspect of like the deep political side of Parliament ruling my life most of the time, and being away for sitting weeks and supporting volunteers to be able to meet with their MPs and lobby and engage with like key ministerial moments and Senate inquiries and stuff like that. So there's like lots of different aspects of like the spending time with people, like young people who want to take action and building the capacity and skills, but then there's also the deep political side and there's also the community work side.
Yeah. It's big work, undoubtedly, and it's heavy work. So what keeps you motivated? What motivates you for the work that you do?
Yeah, I think I feel like there's something every hour. Like I feel like I really oscillate between different feelings all the time, whether it's like deep anger at all of the institutions and bad decisions that are constantly made, whether it's like hope that there are all of these young people that actually like deeply care and have such an increased level of like knowledge and consciousness as like this generation that is the most well-informed, the most like has the highest rates of access to information and truth. Whether it's like sadness that also is a motivator in some forms of the things we're seeing in our world that have already been lost and will be lost, and the sacrifices that have been made for like greed and corporate gain. So I think it's like a whole range of things, and you kind of just like find your middle ground of somewhat peace in all of that, knowing that you're actually trying to contribute to something more and bring all of these other people around you into that space as well, which I think can be both, challenging in dealing with that level of emotion, as well as like supporting hundreds of other young people to deal with that level of complexity of emotion at really early stages of their life when they're not actually at their most emotionally mature.
Because we are talking existential kind of feelings,
right?
The world burning is quite existential.
And it's like volunteers who are like aged 12 to 30, which is a huge, group of people. And it's actually two different generations as well. Of like millennials and Gen Z. And I definitely sit in the Gen Z box. I don't really get millennials, to be honest. I don't like understand their life views, but that's fine. That's not my problem. That's other people's problem. And so, yeah, I think there's just like a lot of complexity in the emotions that you deal with. But I think knowing that you're actively trying to create something that's better for like everyone around us, but also trying to create the large-scale transformation for generations to also come and to benefit from and thrive in, I think is special.
Yeah. You're evidently very passionate about the work you do, which I love. Do you think you were already deeply passionate about climate justice and racial justice, and the role came up and, you know, you got it and it's kind of been the dream? Or did you kind of engage in AYCC and grow in your sense of passion, or kind of, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I think my journey very much started when I was 17 and I just finished HSC, and I went along to a training camp that AYCC was running, where they were basically like, here's a weekend where you can like learn about climate change, learn about all of the different aspects and drivers of climate change, whether that was like, yes, fossil fuels, but also like corporate gain and white supremacy and the extraction of like First Nations land. Like, it was such a complex weekend and lots of emotions that come into it. But I think one of the things that I really remember from that period was noticing how like the climate movement, youth climate movement at that point, was like such a typical brand of young people, of like kind of left-leaning, like hippie-esque, keep cup carrying like young white people.
Like our Uniting Church-esque people.
Which I don't think is bad, but I was very much like, I feel like I'm the only person in this room that has like grown up in like a deeply multicultural working class community that has like seen the impacts already, that aren't just like talking about this in the abstract of these bad things are going to happen to us in the future and they're happening to other people over there somewhere right now. And I was like, those are my people, that's what's happening. Like, I think it was a disconnect of like lived experience.
Yes.
And so, yeah, I felt like that really kicked in my like drive to try and invest in like multicultural communities and multicultural young people, to actually be able to come into the room, to understand their experiences and their connections to these things, to be able to connect like their experiences of climate change as it already existed in their lives to what was happening, whether that was, I think huge levels of multicultural people, particularly migrants to this country, already are seeing like climate change happen in their homelands, let alone living in areas that are already experiencing higher levels of like environmental degradation. Whether that's like Western Sydney being 10 degrees hotter on any given days, and if it's 42 degrees here, then it's probably close to 50 degrees in Western Sydney. Where there is huge levels of multicultural communities. It's the biggest multicultural area in the country. And so, these people are like seeing homelands flood and cyclones and things, as well as also experiencing climate change kind of twofold. And so I thought that was, a really important piece of why, I wanted to like keep at it with AYCC, and we've come a long way, I think, in the last 7 years. But I think it was like very much that pathway, not this bright, shiny role appeared and then I stepped into it. It was very much you have to forge your own future and the pathways that you need.
And you mentioned the kind of more lived experience for you. Part of your story, as I understand it, is the story of being a migrant or coming from a migrant family. Both. Being someone who is not of Anglo descent, but also growing up in a reasonably conservative Christian family.
Very conservative.
This passion for, was this kind of stuff talked about when you were growing up? You know, racism or climate injustice and stuff?
Definitely not. My family are quite borderline far right.
Okay.
So not really, unless it was like, my parents have like, I don't know whether this is a win. I try to think of it as a win. But my parents have moved from climate change isn't real to climate change is an act of God destroying the earth for punishing sin. And I'm like, is that a win? I don't know if that's progress.
It's maybe better, but it's
not quite the framing that I think is what people need to hear. And so, it wasn't really talked about in explicit terms when I was growing up, which I also think is like, higher rates of people actually just not knowing about climate change in the same way that they do now. But I do think it was like in explicit ways as well, where there is like, it's our role to care for creation and like we're placed here to also look after the world and the people and the future.
Yes.
And so I think there was like nuggets there that I kind of latched onto as a kid, where I was like, that makes sense to me. That should be something I care about.
Okay.
But I don't think that necessarily translates into the complexity of such a huge issue that is quite a giant existential threat.
Yeah.
Which is okay. I guess I was like 8. You don't really explain that to an 8-year-old, I guess.
Yeah, no, sure. But you know, you are now who you are with the passions that you have. I assume with some unlearning through the years of some stuff. But your faith seems to have remained a pretty integral part of your life. How? Why? Like, what is it about it that has remained for you?
I think with activism, I don't call myself an activist actually, partially because I feel like activism is actually just community service and is very much about giving back to your community what your community always gave you, and kind of nourishing what you receive throughout your life to be able to give back to other people in kind of like a doubling of gifts and output in a way. But I also think that like faith plays a huge role in most people's sense of activism in some form, whether it's literally just the belief in something bigger than yourself, whether that's like people power and the ability for people to come together to have good intentions, to want to build something better together.
Yes.
Or whether that's faith in something like God. Like I actually think those things are actually really intertwined. And I think I've seen in my lifetime supporting so many young people that a lot of young people have actually come into faith in different ways. Like I think there's a lot of different ways of like reclaiming faith for themselves and understanding who they are in the context of faith as it works for them, which doesn't necessarily mean like very literal readings of like texts around faith, but I think is very much a belief in something bigger than themselves that drives the change that we see and gives people the energy and passion and skills to be able to take action on that. But yeah, I think for me, like faith and culture is very intertwined. I think there's like intergenerational histories of like, I can name all of the ancestors I've had since British colonisation when my family converted to Christianity. British colonisation of India, by the way. And yeah, I think like that's a special thing, but that also kind of resembles the way that faith and culture are actually one and the same in a lot of like multicultural kind of understandings of family and culture and heritage.
Yes.
Where, yeah, everything that you are, you can't like separate these two things from each other because culture is faith and faith is culture, and your community is one and the same. And stepping away from one is actually stepping away from both. I don't know how to explain it, but I think that's like an introduction to...
is the word that's coming to mind, right?
I think it's just like they are actually just the same, and you can't have one without the other.
Okay. Do you think that your sense of faith affects or intersects with the work that you do?
Yes, definitely.
Are you able to name any ways that that is the case?
Yeah, I think kind of going back to that belief in something bigger than you, I think in the work that like we do around young people and like huge worldwide problems that are driven by these huge forces, I think it's very easy to, like you can really see it when people start to fall into like the individual mentality of like spiraling and thinking that it's up to them. I think faith actually plays a role in like alleviating some of that pressure onto you and being like, there's actually a bigger plan at play, and it's not entirely just up to one generation to kind of fix this. But I also think there's like faith in like things will actually get better. Like it's not just the end times. I hope it's not the end times. That'd be embarrassing to look back on this.
Whoops.
Called it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's like this concept that things actually have to get better, and that things have happened in history that you can read about in the Bible that have been world-altering, awful times, and yet people have actually still been able to recover and have faith and restore the world as it is. And so it's kind of this belief in the cyclical nature of like faith in God and how God works in our world and has worked for thousands of years before any of us were here, before climate change existed. that I think is really integral to maintaining positivity and hope that we can change things.
Okay. Yeah, I've got a couple more questions, and then I'm going to throw it open to anyone who wants to ask a question of Grace. How did you and Mick find Black Art at Uniting Church? Like, literally, how did you come to be?
Yeah, we actually had a whole heap of friends, weirdly most of them in WA, that recommended Luck. I know, so random. But it was one of those things where we were like church shopping, being like I had a church before that I was like, I think you're okay, but this isn't like my lifelong commitment to this place.
Okay. Yeah.
And yeah, we wanted to find a church that kind of worked for both of us as a couple. And yeah, we just started like asking around to people that were both values aligned, but also Christian. And a lot of people, I think at least 5 people independently who don't know each other, all recommended Luck. And we were like, oh, I guess we can check out this place. And then we kind of like walked in the door and we were like, well, this isn't a normal church. Like, what kind of place is this? Yeah. And yeah, kind of never really looked back. I think it was like one of those things. We had a secret signal for like, let's get out of here kind of churches. And then other churches where we were like, we'll give it one more shot. And then we never had used I actually really like this place signal. And then that was the first time we used it on Luck. And here we are, like years later. Never backed out, so.
I'm so glad you found us, particularly because, as you're aware, there are many people in our congregation who have similar passion to you around both climate justice and racial justice. And I think both of those things for members of this community are nourished by their faith, nourished by their discipleship. So I think it's been lovely to have both you and Mick around. I want to throw it open, and then I'll have one more question for you. What questions do you have, my friends? Yes, Lucky.
Recently, we've seen a lot more hard-publicised civil disobedience.
We have.
To climate change. To climate motion, you can pick which one. How do you think that's going to motivate young people to engage in that, and also faith-wise, how that sits with you, and like I guess kindness and Christian values and all those types of things, how it all sits together.
Yeah, both really big questions. These are size questions even. I think the first thing is to actually understand and unpack the concept of violence in the climate crisis. I think with civil disobedience, we often see violence in the form of like slashing fossil fuel executives' tires or like pushing paint onto like the covers of paintings in museums to kind of build awareness of something. But I think the other side of the violence is like the huge, like centuries-long desecration of First Nations land and like the giant existential threat of all of our survival as humanity and, you know, the big things in the world that, we kind of have seen, whether that's like, ripping out of forests for generations, of the tipping points of the fact that there are flowers blooming in Antarctica right now. And so I think when you hold civil disobedience up against like the huge level of violence that the fossil fuel industry and these huge drivers of the climate crisis have actually enacted upon everyday people and the most vulnerable in our societies now, I think it's like that reframing of what is 2-hour delay of traffic versus the entire likelihood of us surviving. So I think, there's like that important framing of violence in the kind of climate era that we're in right now. But I also think that that impact on young people has been like an output of so much anger and grief and frustration of, what we're seeing lost in real time, whether that's like literally languages and people groups and like entire landscapes and the Amazon and the Great Barrier Reef and all of these things that we often attach our identities to as people, because we latch onto our natural and physical world to define us as people and our identities. And so I think a lot of that is the outpouring of grief and frustration over, just how much everything is actually escalating, whether that's last year was the hottest year on record ever, and yet was also the highest emissions we've ever had, despite all of these kind of international pacts to say that we're going to limit warming. And so, I think a lot of that is the outpouring of grief for young people. But I also think that will only actually escalate as things escalate in terms of inaction. And I think those things kind of have always played an equilibrium, whether you look at like historical kind of conflicts around the world, those things kind of always will kind of escalate against each other. I think in terms of faith and the intersection of civil disobedience, I think there's a lot to learn from the Australian Religious Response to Climate Change, ARC, who often do like pray-ins, where they'll occupy spaces like the now Bank Branch, for example, when they were funding like huge coal projects, and they actually won on that campaign and they stopped funding those coal projects. But part of that tactic was that they would hold this space and actually provide an alternative to what it looks like to, provide so much money to these huge, like, desecrating projects versus holding the space for people to actually pray and hope for better outcomes out of that. So, I think it's a complicated thing, but I hope that's a little bit of, like, an introduction to, why civil disobedience is like a part of the ecosystem of what is going on, but is not always the only thing that is happening, but is very much the most public outpouring of grief and frustration, and I think just, a reflection of how angry people feel about how much bad is happening in our world. Yeah.
Thanks, Grace. Yeah, Liam.
Yeah, it really depends on what state they're in. I think there's like the de-escalation conversations that kind of happen. But I think a lot of what I find really resonates with young people who are feeling high levels of climate anxiety, which I would actually say is almost every young person who is ever read the news ever. But I think they often find that actually trying to do something and turning despair into action is often the pathway that they feel works for them to sort of alleviate that. And I think there's different levels of what they want to engage in. Like some of them sometimes just need the space to like withdraw back into themselves and have a moment to process and learn. And some of them are like, cool, I will learn as I go, and I just want to do things, and I want to like go as hard as I possibly can because I believe that this is what we need to see and what our lifetimes and our generation is going to be defined by. And I think we've also seen like this is not the first generation that's experienced this. Maybe this is the first generation that's experienced the level of existentiality around the issue. But I think there's so many generations around like the civil rights era or like the fight against apartheid or all of these huge conflicts around the world where young people have stepped up because they can see the injustice, can see, like, have transparency around these issues. And it's almost always actually been young people that do the groundwork to shift huge societal change. And so I think drawing on those examples of young people have always led, like, the downfall of huge problems in our world, I think inspires these young people to also look back at history and learn and then feel inspired to want to take action. And I think it all seems very dire, but there is actually also really incredible things that are happening and huge wins that are happening with like the momentum that has really happened in the last few years. And so I think that's an important thing to draw on is like, it's never going to happen immediately, like we're not going to flick a switch, but it's this huge levels of like generations and generations of people who were all young people who then grew up and then trained the next generation and like created this endless flow of people trying to actually forge a better world that has meant that we got to where we are right now, which is a better position than we were before. And so yes, I think maybe that helps. I don't know. It's a process. It really depends on like where they're at in their journey as well. I think some of them like just need the de-escalation and they're like, calm down, let's like have a second, versus people who are like, I feel very like helpless in this world. And then you can like draw on examples of when young people have created change and why that's been so important for the world we have now.
Take one more. Yeah, Scott.
I have like 5 questions. Mixed into each other now. The last thought I had was I did a bit of work in the country a few years back. I kind of worked with regional teams most of the time. The last time I really spent proper engagement was probably 2019, just before COVID. And the climate marches, school climate marches were over that time. And the thing that shocked me was that meeting young people out in the regions had no idea what's happening. And I found that to be kind of unspoken advice almost. Like we were saying, oh, are you doing anything with the school climate march? And that was like, what? I'm like, hang on, you're like 16, 17, like, care about climate change, but no idea. And I guess I wonder, like, how do you, what are the advice, how do you bridge them because young people are kind of monocrossed, obviously. There's lots of young people in lots of different communities. You know, how do we bridge that? How do we make those connections? You know, that's a huge question. You have to solve that.
No, you do. You do have to solve it, yeah.
Lucky for you, it's a question we've been grappling with for a couple decades. Yeah, I think that's so true. Like, I absolutely agree that there's like different buckets of young people in like where their understanding is, and there's a whole spectrum that's been like peer reviewed and stuff like that to actually understand and start to map out where different people are at on that spectrum of understanding climate change and then wanting to take action. And I also think that comes and speaks to some of the points around climate justice of like the people who feel the effects first and worst are often those who are being left behind in the solutions and in the progress that's being made. And a lot of the time that's people in regional or remote communities who, have witnessed the land change in their lifetime, have witnessed species extinction, have witnessed like huge coal and gas projects on their like land in their lifetimes. I think, I remember that September 2019. That's actually how Mick and I met, organising Sydney One. Fun fact.
Nothing says romance like a climate
I know,
strike, right?
it's just like classic sitting around the table, organising the country's biggest protest, you know. Great way to make the love of your life.
Absolutely, yeah.
And there was like at least 60 regional towns that took part in that strike, but there were also so many places that just like weren't, like the literacy wasn't where it needed to be for them to be able to take action. And I think there's huge levels of mis and disinformation in those communities as well from so many different sources, and different like access to kind of trusted institutions in those communities as well.
Yes.
But I think for particularly like communities out in the country, particularly like pastoral communities and farmers and stuff like that, I think it's really important to make sure you have the trusted messengers like Farmers for Climate Action, for example, who are kind of like already a group of farmers who are working on climate and kind of draw the links between climate and land change and their jobs and livelihoods with like climate impacts and bushfires and heat waves. And so I think, it really requires trusted messengers. Like I would never be like, I'm a random like inner city young person, I'm going to go out in this community. So it's really important to do the capacity building of the people already in those communities to be able to influence the people around them, as opposed to like transplanting other people. Because that never works, no matter what community you look at. And so I think, part of the work we are kind of looking at doing, particularly in the lead up to the next federal election next year, or maybe this year, who knows, will be around, supporting young people in regional communities to actually be like trained up and have those conversations with their own communities. Because, it's really important that people aren't left behind in these huge, like, sweeping changes that we're seeing, whether that's for progress or not progress. And so I think that's a really important point.
Thank you. The work that you're doing is honourable and hard, and we want to honour the work that you do and recognise that a lot of it is behind the scenes and unseen, but is not for nothing. So we really want to honour that for you. And I'm really, really glad you and Mick have found a faith home here with us. Adrian, I want to change the last song to Your Labour Is Not in Vain, because I feel like that'll work really well. I have one more question for you. What would you like to see churches like Luck be doing in the next little while around the work that you are also engaged in, climate justice and racial justice? What's your kind of vision for spaces that hold those similar passions?
I think there's this example of like how so many of our institutions that exist right now, that exist for positive change, would never have been invented now. For example, public libraries, like what a crazy concept that you would let people from the public borrow books for free and then take them home for free and then supposedly return them for free and then they can just keep doing that for the rest of their life.
Yep.
Crazy concept in this day and age. And I think, this thing wouldn't have been invented now because of the way that our society functions and has moved beyond trust and has moved very much into distrust in a lot of ways.
Yes.
But I think institutions like churches and also places that have the physical infrastructure can provide a really important sanctuary for people who are often escaping heat or bushfires or the physical effects of climate change. So I think there's that side of heat refuges and what it looks like to actually open the doors of a church to be something more than just a building to people, but also just a physical place where people can relax and be and can actually start to adapt to the impacts of climate change.
With no strings attached, right?
Which is just a radical, crazy concept for a lot of institutions and places. But often when people think of a church, they're like, that's a big building, we should knock it down, they don't pay any taxes. But it's actually if it turned into an air-conditioned refuge where people could just sit when it's hot instead of having to wander around Kmart 24 hours where you have to pay money to exist, I think is a really important piece of the puzzle of retrofitting and using the infrastructure we already have in our societies and in our communities to for the greater good.
I love that.
But I also think there's the other side, which I think Luck already does, of actually my first memory of Luck ever was at that September 20 climate strike, when I was standing on the stage in the Domain, if anyone was there. And I just remember hearing these drums. And then I was like, what is going on? We don't know how many people to expect. It's so hot. We were I hope no one comes. It's too hot right now. And then I just over this hill, I saw this ginormous banner and these literally hundreds of people just come over the hill. And we were all who is that? Who is that self-organized? That's so crazy. And it was Luck. It was the United Church with the drums and the banners. And I was like, oh my God, who are these guys? I'm kind of scared. But that was actually my first memory of Luck. Without being in the doors.
Yeah, sure.
But I think that presence of the uniting church, but also Luck in advocacy and it being on the front line of actually being willing to speak to values and what communities need. And I think this is a really progressive suburb and community, and I think Luck really speaks to that, whereas other churches can't actually do that yet, but need kind of the internal pushing and change of institutional change that can happen from within, from existing institutions that are already providing that model and that baseline for people. And then I think as a congregation, because I think people of the church get involved in some capacity. I think volunteering is the biggest act of community service you can really provide. It doesn't have to be in climate. It can be in anything that you really care about. It can be in safe homes. It can be in community care. It can be in whatever way. And I think that kind of comes back to vocation of, I definitely didn't start this vocation in a paid capacity. I think volunteering and giving up your time and energy and the skills that you've been given at this current point in time is very much tied to what you can also give back and what's been invested in you for you to be able to invest in other people. And so, it's a couple of things.
And I would imagine Grace would be really happy for, come and chat to her today or, go do coffee or whatever and talk more about ways to roll up your sleeves, I guess. Please join me in thanking Grace Vegesana.